I only want a dad for Christmas.
The little girl told the silent cowboy at the way station, holding a crumpled letter. Raven Hollow Way Station, Wyoming Territory, December 23rd, 1887. The wind swept across the empty platform like a warning. Cold, dry, and without mercy, it moaned through the cracks of the sagging roof, stirred the brittle boards underfoot, and tugged at a train schedule nailed crookedly to the wall, its faded ink barely legible beneath layers of time. A single oil lantern hung from the crossbeam above the platform, its flame trembling with every gust, the last flicker of something once known as hope. The train let out a final hiss before its wheels clanked and groaned into stillness. No one was there to greet it. No carriages waited. No names were called. Just a woman and a child stepped down into the cold. Ruth held her head high, but her steps were heavy. In one hand, she carried a small bag, patched, frayed at the seams. In the other, she clutched a folded letter, its corners curled, its paper soft from being read too many times. A mail-order bride letter, a promise she dared to believe might still be real. Judy, just 6, followed behind. She said nothing. Her coat was a size too big, her scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her eyes were quiet, watchful, older than they should be. She did not ask where he was. She had learned long ago that promises often came late or not at all. The train groaned and pulled away, trailing steam into the gray sky. The platform fell silent. They waited. The wind thickened, now carrying flurries. The small way station behind them had no ticket clerk now. The last man there, the old station hand, locked the freight shed and tipped his hat. "Not many men keep promises out here," he said softly, almost like a warning, then walked off toward the distant hills. Time dragged like an injured animal. Ruth sat down on a cold bench, keeping Judy close beside her. She opened the letter once more, her gloved hands trembling. The words stared back at her. "I'll meet you at Raven Hollow, December 23rd. I promise you and the child a new beginning." Dusk settled. Just beyond the station's edge, beneath the eaves of the old way post building, once used for horse changes and mail, a man sat motionless on a wooden step. He wore a long coat, dusted with snow, and a wide hat pulled low. He had been there before the train came, and he had not moved since. James Hollow McCrae. The town called him Hollow, for his eyes, for his silences, for the way he passed through places without leaving anything behind. He did not talk much, he never stayed long. But tonight, he stayed still. Judy noticed him first. She stood, leaving her mother without a word, and crossed the platform. Her boots crunched the frost beneath her, but she walked without fear. She climbed up onto the wooden step beside him and sat quietly, her feet dangling above the ground. James flicked his eyes toward her, did not speak. Judy reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was lined, written in pencil, faded and smudged from hands too small and hopeful. She held it in her lap, smoothing it with her mittened fingers. Then, she looked at him. "I only want a dad for Christmas," she whispered, her voice thin but steady. "Just one. So, Mama doesn't have to be brave all the time." James said nothing. The wind moved again, harder now. It lifted the letter from Judy's lap and sent it skittering across the step, where it landed at his feet. He bent down, picked it up. "Read it." The words were messy, child's writing, but honest in a way most men forgot how to be, and beneath the pencil strokes, something sharp pressed against the ribs of his memory. He had written a letter once, too. Not with a child's hand, but with a man's heart, and he had not kept the promises he made. James stared at the paper. His fingers curled around its edge. The girl beside him said nothing more. She did not look away. And for the first time in years, James Hollow McCrae felt the cold reach deeper than his bones, felt it in the place he thought long gone, where memory still lived, where a man might still choose to stay. The cold fell fast once the sun dipped below the hills. Wind pressed against the station like a restless thing, slipping through every crack and seam in the wood. Ruth rubbed Judy's arms through her coat, trying to keep the little girl warm as they sat on the bench beneath the flickering lantern. No one had come. No voice called her name. No boots crunched over the snow with purpose. Judy leaned against her mother, eyes heavy but still watching the man across the platform. James McCrae remained where he was, unmoving. His hat stayed low. He had not said a word. Then he stood. He crossed the platform without sound, boots barely scuffing the frost-covered boards. He walked past Ruth and Judy without looking at them, vanishing into the shadows near the general store. Ruth tensed slightly, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. Minutes later, he returned. He did not speak. He carried a small paper bag in one hand and 2 tin cups in the other. He walked to the bench, set the bag down on the wooden table near them, and placed both cups carefully between mother and child. Ruth opened her mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to ask. But the man had already stepped back, retreating to his usual place across the platform. He sat down, exactly where he had been before, as if he had never moved. Steam rose from the tin mugs. Judy looked at her mother, then reached for one. "Careful," Ruth said, uncertain. Judy sniffed the rim, then took a small sip. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "It is hot chocolate," she whispered, a small note of wonder in her voice. Ruth looked at the second mug. Her fingers itched with cold. She did not reach for it. The night deepened. With each passing minute, the air turned sharper. The wind carried tiny shards of ice that kissed exposed skin like needles. Across the town square, the lone inn's windows glowed yellow, soft and warm behind frosted glass. But when Ruth knocked on the door and asked for a room, the answer was quick. "Booked solid since Wednesday," the innkeeper said. "Holiday travelers and 2 families snowed in. Try again after Christmas." So, they returned to the station platform. Judy's cocoa had cooled, but she cradled it in both hands, grateful for the warmth. Ruth glanced across to the bench. James had not moved. Then he did. Again, without a word, he stood. He motioned, not quite a wave, not quite a gesture, toward the far end of the station, where a small supply shed stood near the freight line. Its roof sagged, and one shutter hung crooked on the hinges. But it had 4 walls. Shelter. Ruth hesitated. "You know someone who owns it?" she called out. James did not answer. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the building. Ruth debated. Then she took Judy's hand, the cocoa cups, and the small paper bag the man had left behind. They crossed the station to the shed. The door creaked open with a push. Inside, the air was musty, but the walls held off the wind. Dust and old burlap sacks filled one corner. Ruth set down the bag. Inside were 2 biscuits and a wrapped piece of sugar for the cocoa. As she was laying out their things, she heard soft scraping outside. She opened the door just enough to peek through. James stood in the dark, hammering a broken hinge back into place with the flat end of a rock. He shoved a strip of folded cloth into the gap under the door. Then he pulled something from his saddlebag, a rolled-up blanket, and placed it gently near the threshold. Ruth watched in silence. He never looked up. He never knocked. He finished patching the gaps, then stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Ruth stood there a long while, holding the door half open, the blanket still at her feet. She swallowed, throat tight. When she finally stepped inside and spread the blanket over Judy's legs, the little girl looked up and asked, "Is he staying here too?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "No, honey, he is just still here." She turned to glance back at the door. For the first time in many months, someone had helped without asking why, had given without demanding something in return. Someone had stayed. The morning came gray and still. Snow had fallen lightly in the night, enough to soften the world but not cover the hardness beneath. Ruth wrapped Judy in the extra blanket before venturing out, leaving the little girl curled on a pile of burlap inside the shed. Judy did not protest, only nodded and pulled the blanket tighter. Ruth stepped into the town with her letter in hand. She asked first at the telegraph office. "Thomas Raleigh," the clerk repeated. He was a thin man with ink on his sleeves and a cracked monocle. No messages for that name, no delivery records either. He shook his head without much thought. Name does not ring a bell. Ruth tried the general store next. The woman behind the counter squinted at the name on the envelope. Her hands were red from cold and soap. She paused a moment, then said flatly, "You are the third woman this month." Ruth blinked. "I do not understand." There was another before the snow and one before that. Both left on the morning train after waiting a day or two. The woman turned back to her jars of penny candy. "Ain't no Thomas Raleigh here, miss. Never has been." Ruth stood in place for a long moment. Her fingers loosened their grip on the letter. She did not cry. Not here, not in front of strangers. She thanked the woman, turned, and walked out without buying anything. Outside, the wind bit through her coat like it was nothing. She folded the letter again, slower this time, not with care, but with disbelief. The seams were beginning to tear from overuse. The ink had faded, like the voice behind it had never been real. Back at the shed, Judy was coughing softly, small, dry bursts she tried to hide behind her sleeve. Ruth knelt beside her and checked her forehead. No fever, just cold, too much cold for too many nights. She wrapped Judy tighter and kissed her hair. Then she saw it. Near the door, set gently on top of the folded blanket, a canvas sack. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were 3 boiled eggs, a half loaf of bread, and 2 small potatoes. At the very bottom sat a single wrapped piece of sugar. Ruth stepped outside, heart pounding, scanning the edges of the yard. There, near the corner of the shed, stood James. He was already turning to walk away. She called out, voice sharper than intended, "Why are you doing this?" James paused but did not turn. "I did not ask for help," she said, stepping forward. Her voice cracked despite herself. "I do not need pity." He stood still for a long moment. Then he turned just enough for his voice to carry. "I do not pity you." Ruth swallowed, fists tight. James looked at her, eyes unreadable under the brim of his hat. "I just do not want anyone waiting for someone who is never coming." The words landed heavy. Ruth blinked, stunned. Then, without warning, the weight of the last 2 days, and the months before them, collapsed inward. Her breath hitched, her shoulders shook. She covered her mouth with one hand, but it was too late. She began to cry. Not loud, not angry, just broken. James said nothing more. He nodded once, barely, and walked away, his boots crunching the fresh snow in quiet, steady rhythm. Ruth stood there, the canvas sack still in her arms, and wept for the promise that never arrived, for the kindness she did not know how to trust, and for the stranger who stayed when no one else had. Snow clung to the earth in patches, melting where sunlight found it and hardening into ice where it could not. By mid-morning, James was fixing the broken rail fence behind the freight shed. The boards had come loose in the last storm, and one post leaned dangerously, threatening to fall with the next gust of wind. He worked with quiet efficiency. No wasted motion, no muttering under his breath, just the rhythm of hammer against nail and the creak of wood settling into place. From inside the shed, Ruth watched him through the slatted window. Judy sat cross-legged on the floor, a small chunk of blackened coal in one hand and a flat piece of wood in the other. She had found the board leaning against the wall behind the burlap sacks and had begun drawing without a word. Ruth approached to see what she was making. A stick-figure woman with long hair, a smaller stick figure beside her, and a tall one wearing what could only be a wide hat. Ruth's breath caught. "Judy," she said gently, crouching down. Judy looked up. "That is you," she pointed. "That is me, and that is the cowboy." Ruth offered a soft, cautious smile. "We should not draw people who are not ours, honey." "But he helped," Judy said simply. "And he did not go away." Ruth touched her daughter's head, smoothing her hair. Still, it might make him uncomfortable. Later, Ruth stepped out with the drawing tucked into her coat. She found James driving a new post into the frozen ground. "I am sorry," she said, holding out the board. She did not mean anything by it. James took the board without a word. He looked at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he handed it back, shook his head, and returned to his work. "She meant something," he said quietly. That afternoon, Judy followed him. She stepped carefully across the uneven ground, trailing behind James as he walked the fence line. She did not speak at first, only mimicked his steps like it was a game. Finally, she broke the silence. "Did you ever play guitar for your little girl?" James paused mid-step. Judy looked up at him. "Mama says some cowboys sing. Did you?" He adjusted his hat, eyes still ahead. "I used to." "Did she like it?" James hesitated. She was not old enough to say. Judy nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than she should. James went back to work. He did not tell her to leave, and she did not go. The sun began to dip lower, casting golden light across the snow-dusted field. Judy wandered a few feet away, balancing on a beam of frozen wood. Her arms stretched for balance, her boot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow. She slipped. There was a small, sharp cry, then silence. James dropped the hammer instantly and moved faster than he had in years. He reached her just as she hit the ground. His arms were around her before she even had time to cry again. He lifted her carefully, checked her face, her hands, her knees. "You all right?" he asked, voice strained. Judy nodded, startled, more than hurt. James exhaled. His arms tightened around her once, reflex, and then he stopped. His body went still. In that moment, memory slammed into him, like a runaway horse. He remembered holding someone smaller, softer, warmer, the smell of milk and powder, a coo that had barely become a voice, a cradle that never rocked again. James blinked hard. He set Judy down gently, his hands trembling. Then he took 2 steps back, heart thudding in his chest, guilt rising like floodwater. Judy looked up, confused. James turned away, jaw clenched. He could not look at her, not yet. He walked back to the fence and picked up the hammer again, but his hands did not steady. He wanted to stay. He wanted to be something more than a stranger. But the memory of who he had failed haunted every inch of him. He drove the next nail too hard, bending it. From behind him, Judy said quietly, "It is okay. You do not have to be scared." James did not answer. But he did not walk away, either. The wind howled that evening as the cold crept deeper into the boards of the freight shed. Ruth sat near the makeshift stove James had rigged from a rusted barrel, holding the letter in her hands, her fingers tracing its worn edges again and again. Her lips moved silently, as if willing the ink to speak something different. "Would you mind looking at it?" she asked softly, holding it out to James as he finished stacking wood by the door. "The address. Maybe I missed something." James took it without a word. He turned the envelope over, studying the return mark, the handwriting, the faded post office stamp in the upper right corner. He frowned. "There is no such office in this county," he said finally. "And the routing number, it is not right." Ruth blinked. "What do you mean?" He handed it back slowly. "It was never processed, just made to look like it was." Her breath caught. She stared at the envelope in her lap like it had turned to ash. I checked," she whispered. "I asked around. I waited weeks for the letter, I thought." Her voice broke. Why would someone write it if it wasn't real? James did not have an answer. Ruth set the letter beside her and put her hands in her lap. She was still for a long time, eyes blank. Then she folded over, face in her hands, and for the second time in 2 days, she cried. Only this time, she did not try to stop. That night, she curled into Judy's side, her back to the door, silent. Long after both mother and daughter had gone still, James stepped quietly to the edge of the shed. He pulled something from his coat, a small, worn leather notebook, and set it gently beside her bedroll. Then, he walked away. Ruth found it in the pale morning light. She opened it. There was only one line written inside. "Don't lose your soul, James." She stared at it for a long time. Later that morning, James was sitting on an overturned crate, cleaning a tool when Ruth approached. "I found the notebook," she said. James gave a small nod. "It was hers?" Ruth asked. "Yes," he said. "She gave it to me before the train." Ruth waited, but he did not continue. So she sat beside him, not too close, and waited longer. James finally spoke. "My wife's name was Helen. She was steady, braver than me." He paused. "She brought our daughter to see me. I had not been home in 3 months. I was working the lines up north. Promised I would come back in time for her christening." He exhaled slowly. "They came by train. It derailed 4 miles out from Pine Bluff." Ruth closed her eyes. "I did not even know she was coming early," James continued, his voice flat but thick beneath. "The letter telling me arrived 2 days after the accident." He looked down at his hands. "I buried them both in the same grave. No markers, just wildflowers when they bloom." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "You stopped talking after that." James gave a slow nod. "I figured if I stayed quiet long enough, no one would ask." They sat in silence. 2 people who had waited for someone that never came. 2 people who carried ghosts instead of goodbyes. James finally said, "You and the girl, you deserve better than lies in the mail." "So did she," Ruth replied. Their eyes met for the first time without fear or weight. And in that moment, something shifted, 2 broken lines beginning to run parallel, not yet touching, but no longer apart. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the sky stretched wide and white, promising more snow by nightfall. Raven Hollow was still, save for the distant sound of a bell clanging in the chapel that no longer held services. Behind the freight shed, James worked in silence, dragging dry branches from the brush line. With a length of old twine, he tied them together into a crude cone and propped it upright just outside the shed door. Ruth and Judy stepped out to the cold. Judy gasped. "Is that a tree?" "Something like it," James murmured. The branches were crooked, dry as bone, with tufts of brittle needles hanging on in places. James pulled from his coat a short piece of knotted horse rein and hung it near the top. Then, From his pocket, a dull tin spoon. He tied the spoon to one of the branches with twine. It twirled gently in the wind, catching what little light there was. "It is beautiful," Judy whispered. James gave a soft grunt. Ruth tilted her head. "You made this?" "I figured. It felt wrong not to have something." Inside the shed, later that evening, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of heated apples. James reached into the corner and pulled out his guitar. The instrument was weathered and warped. One string was missing, and another held tension only out of habit. He sat on the crate and adjusted the tuning as best he could. Ruth looked up, surprised. Judy sat straight, eyes wide. James strummed once. The sound was broken, hollow, but something about it hummed in the ribs. Then he played. The melody was uneven, notes sliding off pitch and falling short, but it was a lullaby, one he used to hum before he had words for grief. The fire crackled softly beneath the music. Judy leaned against her mother, eyes dreamy. When James stopped, no one clapped. They just breathed quietly together. Judy stood and walked to the back of the shed. She rummaged through her little cloth satchel and pulled out a small, smooth piece of wood. She walked over to James and placed it in his palm. He looked down. Someone had carved a word in small, careful letters. "Dad?" James stared at it. He did not speak. He did not move. Judy stood waiting for a moment, then climbed into Ruth's lap and curled against her side. James looked at the carving again. Then he closed his hand over it and tucked it into his coat pocket. He said nothing, but he did not give it back. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells, too distant to be real. Ruth whispered into her daughter's hair, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." Judy's voice was drowsy. "It already is." The wind that swept through Raven Hollow that night was cruel. Not the dry cold of usual winters, but a biting, unsettled gust that seemed to carry whispers through the freight yard. The boards on the old shed groaned like they remembered war. James stood outside, fixing the latch on the door with a piece of wire when he noticed the snow. It was not the snow that alarmed him, it was the prints. 2 sets, sharp-edged, fresh, too large to belong to Ruth or Judy, and they came from the direction of the woods, not the town. He turned, alert. Behind him, a voice called quietly. "You saw them too?" James squinted. The night clerk from the freight office was lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "They were poking around not an hour ago," the man said, eyes wary. "Asked if I'd seen a woman with a little girl. Said they had unfinished business. Sounded off." James gave a slight nod, jaw clenched. Back inside the shed, Ruth was humming softly to Judy, who was already drifting into sleep, her tiny frame curled beneath the blanket. James stepped in. He said nothing of the footprints. Instead, he knelt and shifted the bedroll further against the thicker side wall. "You two should sleep here tonight," he said, voice low but firm. Ruth watched him. "Why?" He handed her a small knife. "Just in case, for peace of mind." She did not take it right away. Her eyes searched his face. "You're not telling me something." James met her gaze. "Get some rest." He stepped back out into the cold. Around midnight, the first sound came, metal on metal, quiet but deliberate, then footsteps crunching snow. James crouched beside the shed's outer wall, breath shallow. He saw the flicker of a lantern, then 2 figures, one tall, dragging a pipe or rod behind him, the other hunched, carrying the light. Their voices drifted close. "She had the damn letter. Said he promised money with it. Think she still has it?" "She better. Boss wants that proof." James felt the cold bite through his coat. He stepped out into the open. The two men froze. "Evenin'," the tall one drawled. "You lost?" James asked. "Not exactly. We're looking for someone." "You found me." They studied him, then exchanged a glance. "Back off, cowboy. This ain't about you." James took a step forward, steady. "It is now." "Ex-soldier, huh?" the shorter man sneered. "You gonna bleed for a woman you barely know?" One of them lunged. The fight was brutal, brief. The rod slammed against James's shoulder, knocking him down. His hat flew off. Blood trickled from a gash above his brow. But he got up. He stood between them and the shed, chest heaving, and spoke through gritted teeth. "You want through," he said, voice like gravel. "You go through me." They hesitated. Then the sound of a whistle, sharp, long, pierced the night. The clerk from earlier was blowing into a tin train horn from the platform. The two strangers bolted into the darkness, shouting curses behind them. James did not chase them. He turned and stumbled back to the shed. Inside, Ruth was already awake, sitting up straight. Her eyes widened at the blood. "What happened?" James sank to one knee, wincing. "Nothing you need to worry about now." She fetched a rag, dipped it into warm water from the pot by the fire. Gently, she dabbed his brow. "You are shaking." "Not from the cold," he whispered. He looked away. "I did not protect them last time." Ruth's hand paused. She understood. Judy stirred behind her. She sat up, blinking at the flickering firelight, then looked toward the door. James sat just inside the threshold, his shoulders squared but exhausted. Judy's voice was soft, sleepy. "You are still here." James turned his head, the barest smile touching his face. "That is enough," she whispered, then curled back beneath the blanket. James sat there the rest of the night. He did not sleep. But he stayed. Christmas morning in Raven Hollow arrived with an uncanny stillness. The wind had died down overnight, and for once, no train whistle cut through the pale light of dawn. The town felt as though it was holding its breath. Inside the shed, warmth lingered from the small fire. Ruth opened her eyes slowly. For the first time since arriving, she did not glance toward the edge of the tracks. She did not listen for footsteps that never came. Outside, Judy sat quietly near the door, tracing patterns in the thin layer of snow with a stick. She did not ask, "When is he coming?" She simply hummed to herself. The waiting was over. James returned, just as the light softened over the rooftops. He stepped through the door carrying a bundle wrapped in a cloth. Bread, a small tin of butter, a single wax candle. He set them down on the table, nodding toward the fire. "The store's open half a day," he said casually. "I figured we ought to eat something decent this morning." Ruth blinked, surprised. James was not grim. He was not guarded. He simply looked like a man who had already made a decision. They sat down together, the three of them, around a meal with no ceremony. There was laughter when the butter smeared across James's nose, and Judy giggled uncontrollably. Ruth laughed too, really laughed, for the first time in months, the kind of laugh that startled her own ribs. No one spoke of danger. No one mentioned trains or letters, or cold nights. They just ate. Later, James leaned against the doorway, watching the snow. "I took the roof job at the freight store," he said, not looking at Ruth. She stilled. He was not asking permission, not explaining himself, just stating a truth. "I start after New Year's." Ruth swallowed. "You plan on staying then?" James finally turned toward her. "Yeah, I reckon I do." There was no declaration, no grand gesture, but Ruth understood. He had chosen something, not for her, not for Judy, for himself. That afternoon, James and Judy walked together down toward the tracks. The snow crunched beneath their boots. A station hand, bundled in wool, raised an eyebrow as the pair passed. "Where you headed, little one?" the man asked with a grin. Judy looked up, smiled wide, and answered without hesitation. "With my dad." James did not correct her. He simply rested his hand on her shoulder. Back at the shed, Ruth stood by the fire. The letter sat in her hand, creased and yellowed now, edges curled from cold fingers. She looked at it for a long time. Then she fed it, slowly, into the flames. No tears. No curse. Just quiet release. The paper darkened, curled, then vanished into smoke. Ash floated upward, caught in the draft of the chimney, gone into the gray sky. James stepped in behind her. He opened the worn leather notebook he always carried. Until now, only one phrase filled the first page. "Don't lose your soul." Now, he turned to the next leaf. In his slow, firm hand, he wrote, "I stayed." As twilight approached, the town began to glow, with the soft flicker of window candles and faint sounds of carols drifting from a nearby homestead. Ruth bundled Judy in her shawl as they prepared to leave the shed one last time. James lifted the girl into his arms with practiced ease. They crossed the yard, where the snow had melted in patches, revealing slush and mud beneath. A puddle spread wide across their path. James paused. Then, without a word, he carried Judy across it. Ruth followed. She did not take his hand, but she walked in the same direction. Over the final image, a voice, calm, slow, carried across the screen. "A child does not need someone who promises forever. She just needs someone brave enough to stay today. Thank you for riding with us through the snow-covered heart of Raven Hollow, a place where one man's silence spoke louder than 1,000 promises, and a little girl's Christmas wish gave 3 broken souls a reason to stay." If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your chest, don't just ride off into the sunset. Hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you crave more tales of forbidden love, quiet heroes, and wild hearts on the American frontier, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and ring that bell. We've got more stories coming. Stories where love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. Until next time, partner, may your road be quiet, your fire warm, and your soul never lost.